everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Brewing with 50 Bucks. My name is Stefan. I'm coming to you from the General Warfare headquarters. I am a content creator here on YouTube for Magic the Gathering, so go check me out on my socials. It's on the bottom left-hand side of your screen right now. And so as you can tell from last week, I had a different video come out instead of the Brewing with 50 Bucks episode. I did mention in a new Innistrad predictions video. So we're gonna do that today instead. So I want to change it up a little bit, so we decided to do a little bit of a game, and now we're gonna do the deck tech for Leinore, Autumn Sovereign. So I want to kind of brew with the cards that we have now before we get the spoilers for the new Innistrad block. So let's give a shot at it and let's see how well this goes, shall we? So Leinore Autumn Sovereign is a 0/4 for 2 green and white, so 2 and Selesnya for a legendary human noble with Coven. What this ability is at the beginning of your combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. Then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, draw a card. So the idea with this deck is to build a deck revolving around big power, try getting as much card draw as we can off of Leinore. So her ability is a triggered ability, so you can't activate it any other time except on the beginning of your combat step. So the way we're going to be building this deck is we're going to be taking advantage of the +1/+1 counters, and we're going to be boosting up as many cards as we can and getting as much value off this deck as we can. And as always, we're running this budget brew with a $50 budget, which includes the price of the commander. In this case, since we don't know the price of Leinore, we're adding a $4 tag to this card and excluding the basic land count. Plus, we actually offer a $5 overage leniency, which since we do that, it's just more to say that everybody can build this deck with $50, but you can also add some small extra cards for an extra $5 to make this deck run. So with that, we are not going through categories this time. We're going to play it very, very straight. We're going to get started with all of our creature cards. The majority of our deck is primarily creatures. It takes up about a quarter of our deck, just as much as our lands take up about a third of it. So with that, we're going to start off with Abzan Battle Priest. It's a 3/2 for 3 and a white with Outlast. So the Outlast ability very much complements Leinore. What Outlast is, in this case, for a 1 white and tap it, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature and you only do it as a sorcery. But not only that, each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has lifelink. So as you can tell with Outlast, anytime you have a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, it'll have lifelink. And since Leinore gives +1/+1 counters on your turn during combat, each creature that you have with a +1/+1 counter on it will have lifelink, which effectively would also turn on Leinore having lifelink herself. Abzan Falconer is very, very similar. It's a 2/3 for 2 and a white with Outlast, but in this case, each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has flying. So each one of your creatures now has evasion from ground creatures, so any creature on the ground that does not have flying or reach abilities can't block these creatures, giving you evasion from your opponent's creatures so you can swing in for big damage. Armorcraft Judge is a 3/3 for 3 and a green. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So in Lenore's case, you're going to be suiting up as many creatures as you can, kind of to go wide with this strategy. And in this case, with Armorcraft Judge, you're basically going to be netting yourself more cards with the more creatures you have with +1/+1 counters on them. Now we're going to be looking at both Avacyn's Pilgrim and Llanowar Elves. Each one of these is a 1-mana 1/1. That allows you to tap for either a green, for Llanowar Elves' case, or Avacyn's Pilgrim for a white. Conclave Mentor for a 2/2 for Selesnya, green and white. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, you put that many +1/+1 counters on them, +1, and whenever it dies, you gain life equal to its power. So in this case, you're giving, whenever you're putting more +1/+1 counters on it, you're adding an extra counter on it. So each time Leinore puts a +1/+1 counter, you're actually instead putting 2 on each of one of your creatures. Constable of the Realm is a 3/3 for 4 and a white with Renown 2. So Renown is another ability that very much complements Leinore. So what Renown is when this creature deals combat damage to a player, if it isn't Renown, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it and it becomes Renowned. So And the ability itself is whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on Constable of the Realms, exile up to one other target non-land permanent until Constable of the Realms leaves the battlefield. So this is also a really good card for another old deck brew that I've done for this channel, which is Hixis Prison Warden, which you can check out on the top right hand of your screen right now if you wish. However, with Constable of the Realms, each time Leinore puts a +1/+1 counter on the Constable, you get to exile a target non-land permanent. That's very strong in Magic, considering anytime you need removal, it's right there ready for you. And you can even make the Constable renowned and exile up to 2 of them whenever they would become renowned. So now we're gonna be taking a look at 3 cards that have very, very similar abilities, where first of which is Dust Shell Crawler, next is Pride Malkin, and Tuskguard Captain. So each one of these has the ability, each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter has Trample. Basically, trample is a very strong ability. If you haven't noticed, whenever you trample over your opponents, if they decide to block with a creature and you have more power over the creature's toughness, you can basically deal more damage through your opponent. So with Dust Shell Crawler, when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature. Pride Malkin is the exact same thing, and Tuskguard Captain has the Outlast ability as well. Elvish Mystic is also a mana dork, 1 green mana for a 1/1 that taps a green mana. Now we're looking at Fertilid, which is probably one of my favorite cards to get whenever I was playtesting this deck. So Fertilid is a 0/0 for 2 and a green. You might be thinking to yourself immediately, a 0/0? That's not really good. However, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And for 1 and a green, you remove a +1/+1 counter from Fertilid, and target player searches their library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffles their library. So now you can kind of see why I put Fertilid in this deck. Anytime you're putting a +1/+1 counter on Fertilid, you're basically getting more and more mana effectively in your pool. And you can always use the secondary ability to remove a counter and get more lands on the battlefield as you see fit. You can do this multiple times since it doesn't require Fertilid to tap at all, and it doesn't require Fertilid to get sacrificed in any way. It's just 2 mana, one of them being green, and remove a +1/+1 counter at your earliest convenience. Forgotten Ancients is always a good card, especially in a budget setting. A 0/3 for 3 and a green elemental. Whenever a player casts a spell, you can put a +1/+1 counter on Forgotten Ancient, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from the Ancient onto other creatures. So whenever a player casts a spell, so you can even cast spells and also trigger the Forgotten Ancient. Honestly, that's really good. And considering your opponents will most likely be casting spells on their turns, Forgotten Ancient is going to get bigger, and you can always move around those counters whenever you see fit. Genesis Hydra is a very interesting one I decided to put in this deck. How it works is it's a 0/0 for X green, and when you cast a spell, you can reveal top X cards from your library. You could put a non-land permanent card with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest into your library, I should say. And the Hydra gets +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the amount of mana that you put into the Hydra. So why I put this card in this deck effectively is mostly to get that cast ability off. Basically, if you get to the Genesis Hydra and you're pumping it for, let's just say 8, you can look at the top 8 cards and effectively put one of your creature cards into field, or any one of your permanents on the field. This deck curves out at 6 mana, so anytime you can pay 7 into this, effectively being 9 mana, you're getting any permanents you want from the library onto the battlefield. Next, we're gonna look at Herd Baloth. So whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on the Baloth, you can create a 4/4 green beast creature token. This is where you go wide. This is where you get more creatures to defend, not only defend, but also attack into your opponents as well. Incubation Druid is more mana for you. You can basically tap it already to add 1 mana to any type of land you produce. And if it has 3 +1/+1 counters on it, you add 3 mana of that type instead, which is really good mana and really good to help you get to a further position than your opponents are going to be. Next, we're gonna look at Iridescent Hornbeetle for 4 and a green, a 3/4 that at the beginning of your end step, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each +1/+1 counter you've put on creatures under your control this turn. So basically, this is one of the best ways to flood your board at the end of your turn. With this, you're basically getting to not only create a swarm of insects, but for each one of those +1/+1 counters you put on creatures, it's gonna make you more creatures to not only block, but also more creatures to attack with, and this way you're going to be much more threatening to your opponents. Next is Knight of Autumn for 1 and Selesnya, 1 green and white for a 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you either get to choose to put 2 +1/+1 counters on the knight, you destroy a target artifact or enchantment, or you gain 4 life. So this is a one-time cast with the Knight of Autumn. However, you get to either put +1/+1 counters on it, you get to remove an artifact or an enchantment that could be problematic to your game plan, or if you need the life, you just gain 4 extra life. Next, we're looking at Luminarch Aspirant. So with this one, this is pretty much similar in every case to Leinore. At the beginning of your combat, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. With this, you're gonna be adding another +1/+1 counter, and with this, you can easily trigger the Leinore ability as you see fit. Reclamation Sage is one of my favorite green cards to put in any deck. Basically, when it enters the battlefield for 3 mana, you can destroy a target artifact or enchantment that poses problems for you. Next, we're looking at Rishkar, Pima Renegade. With this you turn your creatures that have +1/+1 counters on them into extra ramp. Anytime any creature that has a +1/+1, or not even just a +1/+1, a counter on it specifically that you control, you could tap it for a green mana. And considering a good majority of this deck is green, that's going to be very, very useful for our game plan in order to get all of our creatures out and in order to flood the board as much as we can. Shalai, Voice of Plenty is next, and this is one of our big bombs in this deck. It's a 3/4 for 3 and a white, a legendary angel with flying. Not only that, but you Planeswalkers you control and other creatures you control have hexproof, which is extremely solid. And the most important ability on her for our case, 4 green, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So like I was mentioning before with Rishkar, the number of creatures that you have that can tap for mana, especially with that blast ability, as long as you can put more +1/+1 counters on your creatures, you're gonna be such a good position for attacks, and you're gonna be such a good position to trigger not only the Leinore's ability to draw you extra cards, but you can also trigger other abilities that carry for +1/+1 counters on it. Verdurous Gearhulk is another good card to add to this deck. 5, a 4/4 with trample, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. So this is a good way to solidify getting a bigger creature on your board, and especially so with getting Leinore not only trigger her draw, but other creatures to draw to activate their abilities as well. And lastly, we're looking at Wildwood Scourge. And X and green for 0/0. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. But whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on another non-Hydra creature you control, put a +1/+1 counter on Wildwood Scourge. Effectively, with Wildwood Scourge, this is going to be getting bigger as long as you're going to be using Leinore for other creatures, since it is putting more +1/+1 counter. It's putting an extra +1/+1 counter on your field, just not on the creature that you're targeting with Leinore, or any other abilities that allow you to put +1/+1 counters on them. Next, we're going to be looking at our instant spells. These are spells that you can cast at any point in time to either get rid of stuff, protect your stuff, or make your stuff much bigger. We're going to start off with Beast Within, which is probably, if you haven't seen my channel before and this is your first introduction, you'll know that this is one of my pet cards, meaning this is probably one of the cards I put in every single green deck, and I personally believe that this card needs to be put in every single green deck. 2 and a green for an instant that you destroy a target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. And this carries over the same way with the next card, Generous Gift. Same thing. I firmly believe this is a good card to put in any white deck, even if it's a deck that only has a certain amount of white. This is an automatic include. Same thing, destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature in token instead. Next, we're looking at Harrow, a good way to ramp in this deck. At the additional cost of sacrificing a land with this spell, you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield. They don't come into play untapped, which is really, really good for you. And then you shuffle your library. Next, we're looking at Hunter's Insight. This is a really fun little cantrip that you could put in your decks. If you haven't seen this card before, for 2 and a green, you get to choose a creature you control, and when that creature deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker this turn, you draw that many cards. So before damage is dealt, and you're basically drawing 5 cards at the end of combat, so giving you much more advantage over your opponents. Inspiring Call is a really interesting card that I've personally come to like. A 2 and a green for an instant, draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible till end of turn. So this way you're not only drawing your cards, but you're protecting your board as well. Invigorating Surge is an interesting card. For this one, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then double the number of +1/+1 counters on that creature. So let's just say you have a big creature that can go in for the kill, and let's just say you have a creature that can go in for the kill with Invigorating Surge. You just have to bluff them out and play it so that you can just knock him out of the game. Make a Stand is another protective card. 2 and a white for an instant. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain indestructible till end of turn. It's a mini Anthem effect, giving your creatures much more power, and it also protects your creatures from any board wipes, giving them indestructible. Nature's Claim is a really good card. For a 1 green mana, you destroy a target artifact or enchantment, and its controller gains 4 life. It's at the small cost of giving your opponents extra life. However, you're removing a problematic either enchantment or artifact. Return of the Wild Speaker is another great pet card that I put in my decks all the time. What this does is for 4 and a green, you either get to draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. So you can't really use this so much with Leinore or a couple of other cards that say human on the text. However, you still have a good variety of creatures that don't have the human subtyping. So you get to draw extra cards off those, or you get to pump them up for an extra 3 damage. Return to Dust is a very, very effective white card. For 2 white, you exile target artifact or enchantment, and if you cast this during your main phase, you get to exile another one of those. So you get a 2 for 1 if you just choose to cast this on your main phase. Or just exile an important artifact or enchantment that can net an infinite combo from your opponents. Return to Nature is another removal spell. With this, for 1 and a green, you either get to destroy a target artifact, destroy a target enchantment, or you exile a card from a graveyard. So this, not only you destroy an artifact or an enchantment, but you can also negate any graveyard effects, where you can exile an important piece of their combo or an important creature that they are looking to bring back. Sylvan Reclamation allows you to exile up to 2 target artifacts or enchantments and has a basic land cycling of 2. So with this, you get to discard this card and you search your library for a basic land card and reveal it, put it into your hand and shuffle your library. Next, we're looking at Unbound Potential. With this one, a 1 and a white, you get to choose either put a +1/+1 counter for each of up to 2 target creatures, or you proliferate, and you have the ability to entwine it. So what entwining does means that if you pay an extra 4, if you pay roughly 6 mana, you could put a +1/+1 counter on 2 creatures of yours, and you get to put an extra 1 of them. That's how proliferate works. You basically add an extra counter on each one of your creatures. And the last instant we're talking about is Unbreakable Formation. With this, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. This is a great way to protect your board, especially against board wipes or targeted removal if you don't want your opponents to completely get rid of your field. Next, we're going to look at our sorceries. With these are cards you can only play during your turn. However, with these effects, they can make or break a game. So first one we're talking about is Camaraderie. For 4 green and white, you get to either gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures you control. Creatures get +1/+1 till end of turn. With this, going wide with this deck is a great way to use Camaraderie. This way you get to draw more cards and you gain more life the more creatures you have, and it gives you a small Anthem effect until end of turn, giving your creatures +1/+1, so that way you can get some extra damage in. Cleansing Nova is probably the only board wipe in this deck that we have. 3 white, you get to either destroy all creatures or destroy all artifacts and enchantments, whichever one poses more problems for you. Cultivate is extra ramp. It's basically a green staple. You search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put one of them into the battlefield tap, and the other into your hand, then shuffle. Kadama's Reach is the exact same card, basically for the same casting cost, but a different block and a little bit more pricey. Map the Waste is another search effect. However, instead of it only searches for 1 basic land, and put it onto the battlefield tapped. But you also get to bolster, which means you just choose a creature with the lowest power, or sorry, lowest toughness among creatures you control, and put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this way you're still getting that synergy with your creatures and with this deck, adding an extra +1/+1 counter, and you're also getting a land out of it. Overwhelming Stampede is one of the only win cons in this deck. 3 green until end of turn, creatures you control get trample and get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. This is usually a game ender whenever somebody plays Overwhelming Stampede. Rampant Growth is basically map the waste without the bolster ability, allowing you to search your library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle. Scale the Heights is probably one of the best cards in terms of ramp in this deck because it's very multifaceted. Not only do you get to put a +1/+1 counter on one card target creature, not only do you gain a life, you can play an additional land this turn, and you can draw a card. It does 4 things for 3 mana. A lot of people are overlooking this card, but I personally believe this card should be in much more decks. Shamanic Revelation is another way to get for you guys to draw some extra cards. With this card, you're drawing cards for each creature you control, and with its ferocious ability, if you have creatures with power 4 or greater, you're getting 4 life for each one of those creatures. Now, Vastwood Surge is another interesting card that synergizes well with this deck. 4 mana card, and you can pay the kicker's cost of 4. If you have 8 mana, you can pay for this, where you get to search your library for up to 2 basic lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And if it was kicked, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. A little bit of a hefty price to pay for this card. However, this will come in clutch for you whenever the time is right. Last sorcery we're talking about is Wanderer's Strike. 4 and white to exile a target creature, and then you proliferate. Any problematic creatures your opponents have on the field, exile them, and you put as more +1/+1 counters on your creatures. Next, we're going to be looking at our enchantments. These are global effects that affect us in a major way. This way, we get more advantage from our opponents, and we get to synergize well with our decks. With this, we're starting off with Citadel Siege. 2 white, you get to choose one of each. Cons, at the beginning of your combat step, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, or dragons. At the beginning of combat on each opponent's turn, you tap target creature that player controls. So Citadel Siege is one of the only sieges I very much overlook, considering it's never it allows you to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a target creature you control, and you can stack the abilities to have Citadel Siege go off first and then the Leinore trigger to go off, which is insane value. You're putting 3 +1/+1 counters on one creature if you so wish. Or if anything, you just tap your opponent's creatures down and they won't be able to attack with that creature. Colossal Majesty is next, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you draw an extra card. This is one of our budget ways to get some more cards in our hand that is not over the price of $20 or more. Fall of the Imposter is the only saga that we're running in this deck. With this, for 1 white and green, for the first 2 lore counters, you put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature, and then 3, you exile a creature with the greatest power among creatures target opponents controls. That way, you're getting rid of your opponent's problems on the 3rd turn, but you're also activating this to get +1/+1 counters where see fit. Gleam of Authority is a really strong card during my beta tests. I personally believe this can end games very, very quick. With this, it's an aura where you enchant a creature and it gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on other creatures you control. And the creature that is enchanted with it has vigilance and can tap with white and tap it to bolster 1. This is very strong since, for the most part, you want Gleam of Authority to be coming in later on when you establish your board. This way, Gleam can actually give you some more power. You can also pump your creatures in if you ever need to, even at the end of your turn. Next, we're looking at Greater Good. This is probably one of the more expensive cards, but this is one of the best cards in this deck, my personal belief. Since you get to sacrifice a creature and draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then discard 3 cards. With this deck, you're going to be getting a very high power on this deck. So sacrificing high power creatures like 6 or greater gets you a lot of cards, and you get to choose which cards you want to keep and which ones you want to get rid of. Hydra's Growth is another really good card that I've seen in my playtests of this deck. When it enters the battlefield attached to a creature, you put a +1/+1/+1 counter on the enchanted creature, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on enchanted creature. New Horizons is extra mana. You enchant a land this time, but when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, and the enchanted land has tap and add 2 mana of any one color. Ordeal of Nylea is another interesting one, more on the budget-friendly side. You attach it to a creature. When the enchanted creature attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Then, if it has 3 or more counters, you sacrifice the Ordeal. And when you do, you search your library for up to 2 basic lands and put them into the battlefield, tap, and shuffle. And the last enchantment we're running in this deck is Together Forever. 2 white for an enchantment. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you support 2. So with this, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. And for 1 white mana, choose target creature with a counter on it. When that creature dies this turn, return that card to its owner's hand. This completely negates your creatures from leaving the battlefield. You can just keep putting them back in your hand and filling up your hand so that you can keep playing them later on. Next, we're gonna be looking at our artifacts. We're not running too many artifacts in this deck, but the ones that we are running make a difference. First is Animation Module, a 1 mana artifact. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a permanent you control, you could pay 1 and create a 1/1 colorless servo token. And for 3 and tap, you choose a counter on a target permanent or player, and you give them an extra counter on top of it. Fractal Harness is X, 2 in green. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature, and you put X +1/+1 counters on it. And whenever the equipped creature attacks, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on it and equip 2. This is a very strong equipment. I haven't seen this too many times in my playtest. However, this seems very strong and is something I would love to manipulate super much. And the last 2 are the 2 mana rocks that we're running in this deck, Selesnya Locket and Selesnya Signet. This is going to give us our colored mana that we need in the deck. And we're running 2 Planeswalkers in this deck. The first of which is Basri Ket. A 1 white for a legendary Basri Planeswalker. Its +1 ability is you get to put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature, and it gains indestructible until end of turn. It's -2. Whenever 1 or more non-token creatures attacks this turn, you create many 1/1 white soldier creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. And its ultimate, the -6, is you get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So effectively, this is doing everything that we wanted to do. It's not only creating +1/+1 counters for our creatures, this is also giving us some tokens. And its emblem is giving the best of both worlds, putting creatures on the battlefield and putting +1/+1 counters on it. And the second one is Jiang Yangu Wildcrafter. It's very reminiscent of Rishkar, except maybe a little bit better, because each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has tap and add 1 mana of any color. And its -1 is you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And lastly, we're gonna go through our lands. This is gonna be the fuel to our engine that's gonna get us to where we need to be. I'm gonna keep it very simple for this one. 19 forests, 16 plains. That's all we're running in this deck. And that's how you build a human that's dedicated to not only drawing cards, but pumping up your creatures. And with our total budget of around $50, with the inclusion of the price of the commander, which we don't know right off the top what it is, so we're gonna throw in $4 on this card, and the exclusion of the basic lands in this deck, so we come up to a price around $52.55, which is still within our budget. It's a little over the $50 mark, but most people can afford the extra $2.50 to build her. And now we're gonna go over some pros and cons for the deck. So going into the pros and cons for this, we're gonna start off with some of our pros. Some of our pros are this deck is very quick. It curves out at 6 mana, so that way once you hit your 6 mana, you could play everything from your deck and much more, even though you obviously want more mana to cast your other creature spells and more spells ultimately to get you more +1/+1 counters. This deck is very bulky when it comes to its power. This way, you're never fretting about having the lowest power creatures on the board at all. And there's enough evasion and enough ways to give +1/+1 counters that it synergizes very well. I personally believe this deck can actually work, and I personally think that this deck can go the distance in terms of getting to the late game and being able to swing out for the win. Now, some of the cons to this is that it's a bit bulky. And when I say bulky, it means that you can get flooded very, very quickly, and there's not a lot of color fixing in this deck. Board wipes and removal set you back very, very hard, especially if it's getting to your combat and you're about to trigger Leinore and they decide to remove her. It sets you back quite a bit if she's your only method of getting +1/+1 counters. Some of our out of budget recommendations that I would personally put in this deck. These are cards that are above our normal budget, and if we put them in, they would completely assume the majority of the budget. First of which is Colonial Hydra. This is an extremely good card in any deck that needs +1/+1 counters, especially since it doubles itself on each time it attacks. Vortex Monstrous Raider is really, really strong. It's a new card from this year from back in Kaldheim, and especially so, it lets you put twice as many counters on your creatures. Guardian Project. Guardian Project is another really good one, especially since in EDH, each one of your creatures doesn't share the same name as another creature. So you're going to be constantly drawing cards. And also Branching Evolution is another really strong card. You get put twice as many +1/+1 counters on your creatures. And that's going to do it for us today, guys. What do you guys think of this initial brew for Leinore? Do you guys like it, and do you like this kind of content? Please let me know in the comments down below. If you did find some enjoyment from this, don't forget, hit that like button, share it amongst your friends, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. That way, not only are you going to be notified of every single video that comes out of the channel, and I'd not only appreciate it, this would also help with the algorithm, one, and two, to get this channel a lot more exposure. So please do that. And like I mentioned to you before, you can follow me on my socials, bottom left-hand side of your screen. And lastly, I post every Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. A little bit earlier. I've been trying this out for the last couple of weeks, so we'll see how well this fares in the long run. And one last thing, we're running a contest on our Instagram page. With this contest, you actually get to win one of the decks I've brewed on this channel with Leinore included. Now, this contest is running until September 13th. And what you need to do, like the Instagram page, like the photo, comment and tag 3 of your friends, and leave a comment with your favorite color combination in Magic. That's all you need to do. Like our page, like the photo, tag 3 friends of yours, and favorite color combination. So I'll leave it to you for that. Today is the 21st of August. You have until September 13th, so get on it. You may be the lucky one to win a deck from us. So until then, thank you so much, happy week, and I'll see you guys next Friday. And until then, cheers everybody.